My name is Jason Wendroff-Rawnicki. I'm a somatic grief therapist, and I just want to say how excited I am to be hosting this event tonight because Heather and I have been working and colleagues together for probably about a year and a half, and being with her through this whole process of writing this book was absolutely fantastic to be a part of and witness. So when she asked me to host tonight's meeting, I could not say no because we've been through the thick of it with each other and the writing of this book. And so it's absolutely amazing that it's out there in the world and to be read by all of you. So just a couple of things. We want this meeting to be interactive. So feel free to use the chat. So if something that Heather says or something that I say resonate with you, make sure you put it in the chat. If you have questions, we're going to do a Q&A at the end of the call. You can, when you think about it, just write down your question, and then I'll kind of tell you to put the questions in the chat. But if you have something, a question that you think of in the middle, make sure that you put it in all caps. And this way, it'll be an indicator to me to be able to kind of write it down and go back to it so that when we do the Q&A, Heather can answer those questions for you. We do want to make sure that all of your questions gets answered. I'm honored to introduce tonight's author, which is Heather Stang, whose work has redefined how we approach and heal from loss. Heather holds a master's degree in Thanatology, the study of death and dying and bereavement, and has dedicated her career to supporting those navigating grief. Her first book, originally titled Mindfulness and Grief, now known as Living with Grief, is a compassionate resource that has guided many through the pain and loss using mindfulness techniques and self-care strategies. She's also the author From Grief to Peace, a guided journal designed to help people process the grief through reflection and writing. Heather's newest release, Navigating Loss, broadens the conversation to include non-death losses, such as divorce, estrangement, career changes, and caregiving. Other practical tools to help readers regain strength and find peace amid these often invisible but powerful experiences. Tonight, we are so fortunate to learn through her journey and the insights she's gained along the way. So please join me in welcoming Heather Stang, the amazing Heather Stang.
Oh, thank you, my friend and
Yes.
co-host. And you've been an inspiration too, because you approach this work in an adjacent but different way. So I want to just first thank all the other professionals who've influenced my work, and that includes people like Darcy Harris, who works with non-death loss, Ken Doka, disenfranchised grief, Robert Niemeyer, meaning reconstruction. So I stand on the shoulders of giants for sure.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and just to go over a little overview of what's going to kind of happen tonight. So, we're going to hear a little bit from Heather about her inspiration for writing the book. There's going to be a little bit of intention setting so that we can get grounded and really be able to focus on the other non-death related kind of losses that happen. She's going to do a little bit of reading from the book, and then we're going to have a Q&A and we're going to be raffling away, or is it not really raffling away, but
Spinning, I don't know.
spinning away a 3-book gift set at the end of the call. So
Yeah.
So you got to stay to the end to be able to win that 3-book set.
And put something in the chat. Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about the inspiration for this book, and some of it you'll hear in the reading I do tonight. I think it's important for me to acknowledge that even though this is primarily what I would call a non-death loss or a secondary loss book, which secondary losses are those often untended to changes that we might experience after the death of a loved one. So it could be loss of income, loss of somebody to have your dreams with in the future. That can happen in tandem with a death. And also, this book is written for people who haven't experienced necessarily the death of a loved one, but have experienced some sort of, life-changing incident that has forever repatterned how you live day to day. And this book really is born of the pandemic. My previous book, Mindfulness and Grief, which became Living with Grief, that's an 8-step guide to navigating the death of someone. From Grief to Peace, the guided journal is written for all types of loss, but does have a handful of prompts that are specifically tied to the death of a person. This book can be read no matter what your loss is. And the reason why I say it's born of the pandemic is there were so many losses that, whether it was because they were so common or perceived as minimal or perceived as embarrassing or so horrific you just couldn't speak it, a lot of us are still really walking around with that grief. And some of us are walking around with the very real death grief of a loved one. And some of us with kids, a lot of them, it's the grief of not having a normal childhood, the loss of sense of safety, so many things. And I start this book off with a story. I'm not going to read this particular part tonight, but one of my clients was generous enough to share her story of how her partner had a cancer diagnosis during the pandemic. She was a massage therapist, so her business got completely shattered and she had to figure out how to pivot to make ends meet. Her whole community was completely cut off from her with her partner's health. She had to, really like super quarantine, like groceries delivery, all that. And when you look at her trajectory from where she was about to lose everything, and indeed, sadly, her partner did die eventually, not from COVID, but to where she is now 4 years later. It's a big shift. It's an unwelcome change. None of it is wanted. Of course, she would, I wish I could wave the magic wand and, send us all back to 2019 and make that not happen. But the reality is this did happen. And so she had to figure out, how do I adapt? How do I go on? And when you look at her today, yes, there are some very tough days, anniversaries, birthdays, any given day that ends with Y when a certain song comes on the radio. But she's rebuilt her life and rebuilt her career. And so whatever your loss is, whether it's a divorce, whether it's you've been laid off, whether it's financial strain, you've had to give up your job to become a family caregiver, you've worked through an addiction, which is another type of loss. I'm hoping that this book can give you practical tools, because I'm nothing if not practical, to actually tend to the grief and re-envision yourself. I want to give credit to my colleague, Lindsay Whistle-Fenton, who really helped me wordsmith this book. And she's a producer for PBS and produced the documentary, which is called Speaking Grief. I highly recommend anyone who wants to up their grief literacy to check that out. And she went through the book and followed me to make sure I was speaking to a variety of voices and that I wasn't stuck in my own tunnel vision around what grief is. Even though I am a professional and I'm writing this book, it's still easy to get stuck in your own story. So I realized with that pause, it's time for intention setting, isn't it?
Yes.
So for those of you who've worked with me before, I'm a yoga therapist. And so everything I do, I like to start off with some sort of practice to help us get grounded. So I'm not just a talking head, but that you're able to get something out of this. I don't want this to be just, the Heather show. I want you to be involved, whether it's in the chat or asking questions. The most important thing is that you're involved with yourself during this process. So I'm going to lead a little practice, and I invite you to close your eyes if you like, or you can just let them gaze softly somewhere else, something that's pretty neutral. And this might be the first time today that you've been invited to turn towards yourself. And by that, I mean noticing what it feels like to be in your body right now. And that might be pleasurable. It might be not so pleasurable, or maybe you feel a little neutral, or maybe you feel completely detached from your body. Just notice what's really going on. None of this is right or wrong or good or bad. It's just data. How am I relating to myself, my body? Might take a moment for you to slow down and turn inwards. And you can do this by entering into yourself through any of your senses. So it might be noticing the sensation of your breath, or noticing the sounds coming from inside and outside your body. Maybe feeling the temperature on your skin, even things like smell and taste are happening right here, right now, in this moment. And that brings you closer to you because this is your experience. And thoughts are natural. So you might feel that there's a distraction happening in your mind, but really the fact that you notice you're thinking is part of being present with yourself. And the trick here is to, whatever extent it's possible, not follow those thoughts, but stay with the sensations, allowing whatever is naturally arising to be what you become aware of. And now that you are aware that you are aware, maybe ask yourself, what inspired you to attend this event tonight? What brought you here? What's happening in your life, or what has happened? What do you want to tend to care for, to hold, to understand? And as you reflect on this, you might begin to notice a list of losses that you want to address in your life. Forgotten losses, invisible losses, those that are really obvious. And if you wish to place your hand on your heart as just a symbol of having compassion for the person who has gone through this, you can do that as you acknowledge the losses that you bring, that you carry. Even those maybe you've never spoken out loud before. And then set an intention for what you want to do with these. And I don't mean anything specific for right in this moment, but more global, universal intention of caring about these losses or tending to these losses, taking care of you. Or maybe something specific does come up. Maybe you know you need a little more downtime. Maybe you know you need to seek some guidance from a friend or professional. Or maybe you just want to be open to what your next best step is. And so you can take 3 mindful breaths. And when you're ready, find your way to transition out of this practice and come on back. Although hopefully you were here the whole time. So if you happen to have your journal with you, and I know those of you who are in my Awaken Grief Support group probably just naturally brought them with you could feel free to write that down. Or you could also put it, if you feel like it, in the chat box and share it with us. I know that might be a little too vulnerable, and that's okay, but maybe you want to speak and be heard through the text.
And I find if you put it in the chat and claim it to everyone, it kind of loses some of its power over you.
Mhm.
Like when we put a name to it.
There's this bit in the book about Voldemort. In the naming, there's literally a chapter naming what scares you. This wasn't what I was gonna read, but I'm gonna read a paragraph from this.
All right, cool.
And this was really worked through with me with Lindsay. So grateful for that. So this is naming what scares you, which is from chapter 2, The Language of Loss. When we relegate feelings that scare us to a dark corner of our inner world, afraid to speak them, much less examine them, they grow stronger and more powerful and can feel extra scary. This concept is illustrated in the Harry Potter series. The supervillain is initially referred to only as he who shall not be named, because the other characters came to believe that simply naming him could provoke misfortune. Ironically, this refusal to speak of him directly only enhanced his notoriety as a specter of great fear. Your experience of grief operates in a similar way. Emotions, including pain, are potent messengers signaling that something within demands your attention. Neglect them, and just like he who shall not be named, they will go stronger and more powerful. Avoiding your emotions doesn't make them disappear. Instead, they leak out in unexpected ways, an unease you can't quite identify that leaves you feeling unsettled in your own body. Like Lord Voldemort, there, I said it. That sensation echoing through your being has a name: grief. As soon as you name it, it becomes more manageable because you are no longer grappling with an unknown entity. What if you take this a step further and name the type of grief you are experiencing, alongside with the specific feelings of sadness, anger, or fear? Naming your grief is like moving the monster from the shadows into the spotlight, where you may see it isn't so scary after all, but scared, tired, and in need of help. And in revealing the source of your fear, you can diminish its power over you. I will do a different reading in a moment, but I feel like that was just so timely. And I appreciate those of you who are sharing that which maybe was not named before in the chat. And I want to acknowledge that while I'm not going to read them out loud here, after this, I will download this chat and I will read each person's note and care for it. Because part of this work of navigating loss, whether it's death or non-death, is being seen and being cared for. And part of making it through ourselves is understanding that we aren't the only ones who experience it. That even though we feel incredibly isolated in our grief, that it is a very human experience. But that doesn't make it any less painful, but it does make it more bearable. All right. So I'm going to read the part I was planning on reading.
We wanted it to be conversational, right?
Yeah. Well, what do you think? What's your take about that?
Well, no, I'll add a little, if you don't mind, I'll add a
No.
little own little reflection while
Mhm.
we're doing the centering.
Mhm.
Yeah. I was realizing that like there's so many secondary losses that I've experienced after losing my sister, but there are also secondary gains as well. And so
Mm.
it's like I that balance between, yes, there are losses, like I don't know, like just this intuitive gains and losses balance sort of was really living very strongly in my heart, that, like, so finding the gains just as well, just as much as the losses.
You and I talk about this like so much, and I think we may have already talked about it in our podcast. By the way, Jason and I have a new podcast called Moving Grief about how there's a right timing to talking about gains and that it's not transactional. In fact, I know we've talked about it because I talk about this every time I talk. None of this is transactional. None of us wish we could, are glad that we're here, right? But we're kind of forced into learning how to grow, and we learn those gains. And we won't dive into it now, but in our first podcast, you talk about how, yeah, your sister died. That's awful, right? And your business uses the bee, her favorite animal,
Yeah.
as the symbol. And so you remember her and are with her every day. And so while you would probably rather have her around, you found a way to keep her close.
Yep.
And I think that's super important.
And I sort of joke, not joke, that I'm closer to her now than when she was actually alive, because we had a very like tumultuous
Hmm.
relationship.
And that happens with difficult relationships. I feel the same way about my stepdad.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah. All right. Thank you for sharing that, Jason. Yeah. So I wanted to read just a real short part, the prologue. And Jason, I'm going to ask you and everybody else to just have a lot of love and compassion, because this is the first time I've read this out loud to someone, to anyone, and it's a room full of people. And I have to say, as excited as I am about this book, it has stirred up a lot of my old losses. I got interviewed by a newspaper in London about my estrangement with my dad, and I spent a good bit of today crying. Just that grief, that grief is still here. But I think it's also going to, like the Voldemort thing, feel really powerful to read it, especially with so many friends and loving people in the room. So will you do that for me?
Yeah, yeah. And before you read it, if everyone could just put a heart, like go to react and just put a heart, just so Heather knows that and can see the love.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So yeah, sometimes you got to ask for what you need. And I asked for what I need, and I asked Jason to help, and he gave me extra help. So thank you all for that. I really appreciate it. So this is from the prologue, and it's called Everyone's Loss Matters. Oof. When my new husband and I were pronounced man and wife on the Sanibel Island beach, dolphins jumped out of the water. I'm not making this up. It was a gift, a blessing, a sign for sure that the universe sanctioned our marriage. Except, as you can imagine from the subject of this book, it wasn't. 10 years later, we would divorce. It turns out that our so-called wedding dolphins were just doing basic dolphin things. Because I love math and statistics in particular, the fact that our marriage ended is not surprising. If I am honest with myself, the moment my future husband proposed, I felt not joy, but a deep and foreboding dread. And yet I said yes. Growing up, I unconsciously learned that acting on instinct was unsafe. Doing so would lead to being labeled difficult, unreasonable, or my personal favorite, histrionic. I was conditioned to do the opposite of what I thought was right. Saying yes when my body said no was a habit that had been deeply ingrained in me since my childhood. This is why I ignored the alarm bells going off in my body the night he proposed. Instead, I focused on the attractive man holding the ring, asking me to be his wife while floating on a gondola in Las Vegas, serenaded by a gondolier whose name tag said Figaro. I entered into a dreamlike state, one in which I could not say no. So I said yes to the fantasy, to the dream of happily ever after, of mattering to someone, of being able to love fully and to be fully loved. And on a deep unconscious level, the goal of the fantasy was to prove my father wrong. I wanted to show that I could be loved. Ever since I can remember, I believed no man would ever want me, because this is what was demonstrated in both the words and the actions of my father. I bought into the idea that I was too aggressive, too independent, too weird. When I was left with a scar on my knee from a bike accident, my father offered to take me for plastic surgery. Generous on the surface, perhaps, but followed with, "You need to get that fixed because when you're older, men will walk by you on the beach and not give you a second glance." I'm not sure what made my 13-year-old self more frightened: the idea of surgery, foreshadowed rejection, or the fact that my father could be so hurtful. When my fiance and I returned home from Las Vegas, I slid into the role of happy bride-to-be with an outward ease masking inner anxiety. To be fair, I did love him. I wanted him to be my ride or die, my partner, my best friend, and confidant. Once married, I did my best to keep the peace, denying the fear triggered by broken promises, gaslighting, and the financial infidelity that years later resulted in a tax lien on our house and my working 3 jobs to support an unsustainable lifestyle. I couldn't imagine leaving, both because I loved my husband and because I wanted to prove my father wrong. It took a particularly chaotic visit from my dad for me to realize that I wasn't the whole problem. I finally saw clearly what my therapist had been telling me for years, that I was in a codependent relationship, well, with everybody I knew. For 2 years, my dad and I tried to repair our relationship, but finally I realized we were just not healthy for each other. Cutting yourself off from a parent is psychologically a very big deal, my therapist told me during a 2-hour session when I had read my dad's and my letters back to back in chronological order. Expect to grieve. I asked my father for no contact, and grieve I did. While deeply painful and not something I entered into lightly, letting go of my parental baggage created a healing space in my life. Once I dropped my story of not being worthy, wanted, or cherished, I was able to investigate the deep fissures in my marriage. And just as I had with my dad's and my relationship, I tried to save us. I wanted to save us. However, as you already know, that relationship ended too. More grief. To many, my story may not seem particularly horrific, and that's kind of the point. That's the reason I'm sharing it. The types of losses I experienced: divorce, parental estrangement, identity, financial hardship, my home, stability, childhood innocence, betrayal, and the dream I had for how my life would unfold, are so common that they are often invisible, not only to others, but to ourselves. Ubiquity, however, does not make any of these losses less painful. My privilege is not lost on me. I know without a doubt that I have access to resources for navigating loss that many in the world do not. I know that my goal in life is to share what I've learned in my personal healing. My goal is to give my life through gratitude, from acting from a place of service, reverence, and compassion to reduce suffering. Everyone's loss matters. Everyone's pain matters. Everyone includes you. As you learn how to cope with the loss that led you to pick up this book, know it is natural for present losses to intensify the grief of previous losses. Together, we will peel back the layers of this very human existence to get to what remains. your ability to do more than just survive. Whether you are learning how to live fully with your loss once more, or for the first time, you will learn to craft a future that resonates with who you want to be. Maybe this doesn't feel possible right now, but one step at a time, you will arrive. I am not saying that grief is a gift, though I do think it can be an invitation. You are in a place you do not want to be. Otherwise, you wouldn't have picked up this book. What wouldn't we trade to have things back to how we wanted them to be? But here we are, you and I and our grief. This book is my invitation to you to mindfully engage with the meaning you have for both what you've lost and what you have left. As you walk with me on this journey, you will learn that joy and sorrow can coexist. While all beginnings have an end, those endings can lead to new beginnings. And as unwelcome as change is, the most significant growth, compassion, and meaning often blooms from our deepest pain. You will start to live again and eventually create this life you want. While this book is an inanimate object, please know that there's a very real human on the other side of these words, wishing that you didn't have to suffer. And I am willing to give you everything I know to help you navigate loss in the healthiest way possible. Let's begin the journey of finding the light in the darkness together.
So beautiful, Heather. If everyone wouldn't mind, what is your biggest takeaway from what Heather just read? And I just want you to put it in the chat so Heather can kind of feel that from you, knowing that her words have that impact. So just take a moment, take a deep breath in, and then just put what your biggest takeaway was in the chat. Shared humanity, that you're not alone in your grief journey. Comfort that you're never alone. Perspective. Awesome. Acknowledgement and normalizing loss, all losses. That common losses mean just as much as, wow, that's a fast start. And it's just as much and should be honored. Validation. Common losses are not less painful. Not alone in your grief. Sometimes we marginalize our own losses, seeing them as too insignificant to tend to. The journey is real, possible, and walk through this as real and necessary. Hope that all grief is unique and all grief is valid. I get it. Thank you for your vulnerability and beautifully written message. It inspires me to be this honest. Every grief is different. Just take that in, Heather.
Sure. Yeah.
Walking alongside, being a companion.
I'm so moved that it landed, and we're not alone, and I'm not alone.
Yeah. We are all carrying grief with us. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's like that balance between the human and the divine, like using that intuition and really listening inward. The importance of allowing space for what you feel, not resisting, understanding your reaction to being human can be taken from us. And grief is not linear.
Right. Well, thank you all for your beautiful shares and your vulnerability too. There's just something about after kind of bearing your soul, having other people show theirs. I think that's why I love grief groups so much, because it makes it safe to go to those places that can be scary and to name the Voldemorts, right? So I want to share just a couple resources before we move into the Q&A. And Jason, you tell me if I'm off track because I need a
Bring
handler.
Yes. Yeah, no,
Um, thank
I was going to bring it from like that to sort of like back to the practical, right?
thank you. Thank you. You and I sometimes think just alike, which is great. So, the first resource obviously is the book. I'm going to put up there, Navigating Loss. It's probably the pinkest book there ever was or close to it. I love this. I love this cover because a lot of my grief work is done, many of you know, on the C&O Canal towpath, which is flat. It's not like this, but outside nature is such a big part. And in this book, there are a lot of Heather stories that, things I've experienced on the trail or my kayak or my bike that have given me insight into my own grief and my own coping skills and my own self-care. And sometimes I'm just like, boom. Some of my biggest epiphanies have happened when I'm outside. So, this is definitely has that piece of me in it. But also it's important to know that because, as I said, I'm nothing if not practical. There is not a single book out there of mine, nor will there ever be, where there aren't exercises. And I actually got the publisher to put in, I don't know if you can see it, but a table of practices. So there's journaling practices, reflections, expressive art, somatic yoga therapy, which Jason, you were my wordsmith in that chapter because you are a yogi yourself. And I really enjoyed collaborating with you on that. And I have to say, you are in the acknowledgments. So, I know that won't buy you a coffee, but maybe you don't drink coffee. I'll find something else, something really, a nice smoothie. But seriously, very helpful. So this is the biggest resource from the night. And since today is launch day, if you go on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or wherever, or to your, local bookstores are probably closed, and buy it, today or tomorrow, it'll really probably help the rankings, which that doesn't necessarily help me at the end of the day, but that's not what this is about. It'll help other people find the book. And that's really what I want because I feel like nothing out there is like this. And I want more people to be able to find it. And also, this is like, you don't even know this, Jason. This is like something that I've had in my head and I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do it. And I figured it out. If you have pre-ordered the book or if you buy the book within the next 24 hours, let's just say by midnight tomorrow night, and you email, and I'm going to give you a very specific email because we don't want this flooding, my one box. I need to be able to sort them out. If you email your receipt, you can just like screenshot it or take a picture of it. I'm not going to be I'm not like, this isn't the FBI checking in on you or anything. If you email it to classes at mindfulness and grief. Okay, so I'm putting that right in there, classes at mindfulness-and-grief.com. Put that in there. Natalie's asking if I'm going to review any of the practices, practical steps. Here's what you're going to get. You're not going to get them tonight, but if you buy the book if you've bought it before or within the next 24 hours and you send that to me, I'm going to be doing a recorded series of 4 of the practices that you will get. Yay, right?
So go out and buy the book.
So go out and get the book. Email that address. Do not email Heather at Mindfulness and Grief. That will not get you in. Classes at mindfulness-and-grief.com with your receipt, and you will get 4 recordings. Members, if you are a member of my Awaken Grief Support group, you're going to get them anyway, but please buy the book. But members of Awaken get everything I do. So, and that's the other resource is, if you're looking for extra support right now, we do offer grief and anticipatory grief support only. But my goal, my hope is to start offering non-death loss support in January. Yay. So, all right. If you have any questions, classes at mindfulness-and-grief.com or type. Now, Q&A, right?
Well, can I give one more other resource that we've just released last week? How can we forget Chatler? So Heather and I we were talking on our meetings and we said we should do a podcast because our conversations are so interesting. So we have launched our podcast as of, was it last week? Moving Grief, and it's on YouTube right now. So yeah, I'll put the link in the chat for
Or
episode
I
five.
can do it while you find the
All right.
questions.
Cool. So anyone that's got a question, now is a good time to pop them in the chat, and we could have Heather answer any of the questions that you have that are on your mind.
Or more comments, more praise.
Right. Any questions? Want to give everyone a minute to
Yeah.
type
Mhm.
those in.
And meanwhile, I'm going to work on this link.
Yeah.
I don't know why I said I would do it. That was silly of me, but figured you might have to read.
Yeah. So one of the questions is, what are some of the brief topics that are covered in the book?
Oh, that's a great question. And by grief topics, I'm thinking you might mean types of losses. Can you just clarify that for me? Oh, and Novelette, it is out in Canada today. It was also Launch Day Canada as well. So, okay. So types of loss. I'm going to actually have a spreadsheet with this, but I'm going to try to remember it. This will be like a quiz. So we obviously have divorce and estrangement because you heard about that. We have in the disenfranchised grief chapter, we have a verbally abusive relationship that also was disenfranchising a human and pet loss. So that was about a difficult relationship. We have relocation, unexpected relocation as a child when suddenly your family moves you. And what if your parents goes away, disappears? We have someone who shared a really moving story about the losses you experience once you become sober. You know, like if you have never battled that, you lose friends, you lose an old coping skill, you lose an old habit. So we have an addictions chapter. There's an infertility and IVF treatment chapter, and there's a pet loss and ritual chapter as well. I also make it super clear in the intro and throughout the book that just because your loss, your type of loss isn't in the book, that doesn't matter. There are so many types of non-death loss. I'm not saying your loss doesn't matter. I mean, the book still works for you because the exercises in it are universal to all types of loss. And I just can't put every single type of I've already thought about a sequel, like I've come up with so many types of losses that aren't in that book because there's only so many pages. So hopefully that helps. There is a chapter 2, one of the very last chapters I talk about universal losses, not necessarily specifically diving super deep into them because they would really require their own books, but environmental grief, political grief, societal grief, changing world, that's a type of grief as well. Um, so yes, Awaken, we have several members in Awaken who have lost pets. We do not disenfranchise that in Awaken. That is one of the things I'd like to pull out as a separate group. So if you join and you have lost a pet, you will be welcomed in there. I know pet loss gets disenfranchised all the time, but I've had humans die in my life, but because of my upbringing, I mean, look who's on the wall behind me, So while it is different, it's still important.
And Heather, you missed a question. How do you
Mhm.
navigate being at a different spot on your grief journey from other people who also lost the same person, like other family members?
Well, you first start by knowing that that is so normal and just like, I mean, Jason, you can speak to this as a bereaved
No.
sibling. Were you and your parents ever on the same page?
Never, never.
Yeah.
In fact, I had to like kind of put a lot of boundaries between me and my parents right in the beginning so that I can figure out how, like, I had to navigate the grief for myself and let my parents navigate the grief for them. And once I was stronger in that ability to navigate the grief for myself, then I was able to then reconnect with my parents and start to create some new memories. So I would always say focus on yourself first, get, have those tools and those strategies, and then like reestablish that in relationship to others.
Beautifully put. And that's a big part of the Navigating Loss book is rebuilding that relationship with yourself and also having compassion for the other people. We do that. We work with this a lot in Awaken because again, the first part of this is understanding that I have never in my years of working with people or going through grief myself or with friends had people where they were all exactly on the same page because we're all unique individuals. We each had a very special and unique relationship with that person. We have our own grieving styles, our own attachment styles. The fact that you're asking the question is good though, because it means you realize, you're in a different spot. Sometimes there's just like this battle to insist we all must be together. I know that's a really short answer, but I hope it gives you some hope in knowing that usually these things do work themselves out if you put yourself first.
So when others don't understand your grief, what's the best way to explain it to them?
Depends on the person, of course, as you know. We always talk about how you have a choice. Like some people aren't going to understand your grief. And it doesn't matter necessarily that they understand it. Maybe it's a coworker or an associate. But of course, if it's your spouse or your partner or your sibling or your best friend, the stakes are a little higher around them understanding it. And so I think for me, because there's probably many, many, many answers to this question, Anne, and I know you practice mindfulness and you're so tuned in. I'm feeling, and I mean, this is something I'd want to like work through with you on an individual level, but I would start by talking about how I feel in my body, how my grief makes me feel tired. It makes me feel heavy. It makes me feel depleted, things that other people have experienced because they aren't going to necessarily understand your grief if they haven't had grief themselves. Right.
So how do you balance dealing with trauma and complicated grief of a sibling parent and tending to live in the meantime and being present for yourself in the process or your life journey?
This is another one where I say it's about focusing on building the relationship with yourself. And actually, I think this probably answers all these questions. Anne's, Legna, Jessica's. I cannot stress enough that we cannot change other people. And yet, we so want to. We also can't make people understand us, although there are ways to be a little more skillful, like going to someone and saying, and I know I'm answering all three questions at once. So like now I will get yours in there. Like going to someone and being like, you just don't understand me. You never listen. That's not going to help things. That's not going to make things better. So finding the right time, the right venue, the right mood, and inviting someone saying, I would like to share with you how I'm feeling. Are you open to that? Is a start. They may not be open to it, unfortunately. And I know I'm kind of hitting on Jessica's and Anne's right now. They may not accept it, but the most important thing is that you validate it, that you be the person you are now. And this is why, unfortunately, our friend landscapes all too often, most of the time, change. And while we might lose people that we really expected to show up for us, this is true with death and non-death losses, we might be really surprised by the new friends that we make, the grief friends that we make, whether in grief groups or an old classmate that reaches out and says, hey, I had a similar loss. So it's important to do whatever you need to do to try to repair things, but also to hold on very loosely to expectations of that outcome, but be open to the new relationships that can flourish. Those are the secondary losses, by the way. Losses of friendships after somebody dies, or after you go through a divorce, or after you have an illness that changes your entire lifestyle. And I want to go back to Legna's question, dealing with trauma and complicated grief of siblings, parents. All right, complicated grief and trauma are best handled by professionals and not siblings in most cases. We cannot fix our family. I know that's so hard, but we can't. And so it's about learning your boundaries, being compassionate. This is a really big and very important question. Very important question. And so while, again, we can't make other people go to therapy, we can't make other people go to a trauma therapist, we can take care of ourselves while we are exposed to it. And you have to be careful that you don't get vicarious trauma, and that it does, but sometimes it does impact you. It's very, very hard.
Okay. How do you speak to someone who is dying without the fear of saying something, without the fear of saying the wrong thing?
In my experience, that fear is always there, accepting that that fear will be there, and understanding that that fear is born of love. I mean, I can tell you things like practice what you want to say, but speak from the heart, speak with kindness, and the right things will be said. But I'm always terrified when something means something to me. But that terrifiedness, sometimes I will say it's rooted in a core wound of I am not enough, or I'm broken, or I'm defective. But other times that it's more of a motivational kind of a terror. It's like an energy that says, this matters. And I really want this to go well. And so I think checking in with where the fear comes from is going to be really important. Yeah.
Awesome. And are there any resources you can think of to get through a loss with a partner, especially these secondary losses that affect you both?
Yes, this book is a resource. And I'm not sure if you're talking about, when you say loss of a partner, you're talking about the end of
That-
a relationship,
It says loss with a partner.
loss
So
with a partner. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a really great podcast episode, and if you want to email me, I'll send it to you. It's from when I had the Mindfulness and Grief podcast, and can't remember the episode, but she really was talking about kind of what I was saying earlier about how you can't change other people, and you're going to grieve in different ways and things like that. And so accepting it's going to be different. I also think working on your attachment styles and how you communicate your needs and knowing your needs is going to be really important. And that's something I do in Awaken. So my grief support group is a great place. You don't both need to come. One of you should probably be doing the work, at least. And we find, the research actually shows that when one person does this type of work, if the other person's open, big changes can happen. So I would say I'm a resource for that. Whatever that loss was that you both shared, whether it's a human being, or a pet, or money, or infertility, whatever. So I hope that helps.
All right. Oh, hang on. How do you speak to a grieving widow who is your brother's wife, especially during the anniversary of death? It was one year anniversary of my brother's death this past Sunday, and I have not known what to do or say.
Mm. It's like such a perfect question to be asking right now, isn't it? I think that my first instinct is that it's not as much about saying as it is about being there for both of you. You're both grieving. You're both feeling the weight. I always like to use words, and this isn't just me having something memorized. It's genuinely from my heart, that there are no words, you know? there are no words. And I imagine you're hurting and, is there anything you want me to know? You can ask questions because you're in a dual role. You are a griever and you are supporting her. And so thinking about how you would want to be supported too, I think is part of it as well. So, yeah, these are all really good questions. Like each of these could be their own chapter.
We should probably write them down. We could talk about them on the podcast, right?
Right. And I mean, well, we have them recorded. So, we can figure this out.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, let's wrap. Let's just do close some closing remarks, and how can they continue their journey with you, Heather?
Yeah. So I will say first just how you can continue the journey. Again, please pick up this book. I'm very proud of this book. Again, this isn't about my ego or me thinking I'm awesome. This is about, again, those shoulders of giants that I stand on. Darcy Harris, who wrote the textbook on non-death loss for thanatologists and grief therapists, she worked closely with me on this book and she reviewed it and made sure it was thorough and, academically accurate. Ken Doka, who coined the term disenfranchised grief, he read the chapter on disenfranchised grief and gave it his blessing. So this book isn't just my book. This is a book that has been directly supported through the world's greatest thanatologist. And I feel very lucky and privileged for that. So I hope you enjoy it and I hope it helps you. And please let me know. And if you want to work with me, we welcome you into Awaken Grief Support Group. And you can find that by going to heatherstang.com and clicking on Grief Support Group. So those are the resources. I want to do an integration as a closing because this goes back to my yoga therapy practice and it's tied to your intention. So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and get comfortable and take a few breaths. Oh, this has been a very heart-centered experience. There's also been some head in there. And so just take your time to come back to yourself and maybe think back to what brought you here. Why you showed up tonight. What your intention was. And then consider what stood out to you from this experience. It might be something I said. It might be something Jason said. It might be something someone else said. Or maybe something nobody said but you thought or felt. And now consider how what stood out to you matters in your life. Why is this meaningful? Even if it's something small. And then think of one thing you can do over the next 24 hours to tend to that. A tiny step. So no big dramatic changes in your life or anything like that, but just a small step in the direction of what matters. It might be adding something to your life. It might be releasing something from your life. And if you wish, you can bring your hand to your heart and offer yourself some gratitude. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and just take a moment to feel the community, to feel your connection, and to remember that you're not alone. And I love you all. And thank you for being here. And thank you, Jason, for taking this on.
Mhm. And thank you, Heather, for just doing all of the work that you do and the way you showing up and serving others.